have a really, really, really fantastic discussion today. Tina, thank you so much for joining. I know that you've been incredibly busy with basically, most of the time when I hear about any aging projects these days, I can be sure that you're somehow involved in kind of like stewarding and accelerating this community along. So thank you so much for your incredible work. It's really, really, I think, encouraging to see that so much amazing stuff is coming from Europe or from the UK. I think it's actually quite a brave move that, you're part of the all-party parliamentary group for longevity, and especially because it's called longevity. So I thought that was also quite a brave move, especially from the UK government. I'm hoping that I'll hear a little bit more on that, connect on that front later. But thank you so much for joining. You've just recently published a fantastic book. Thank you so much for taking time. We're going to discuss broadly Live Longer with AI. I'm going to share a bio of you, and I'm going to share a brief discussion of the talk here for people in the chat. But for now, I want to hear from you. I'm super, super excited to have you on. I've been trying a while, and thank you so much for joining. It's great.
Oh, well, that's so sweet of you. And thank you so much for such a generous, warm introduction and welcome. So first of all, I'm so pleased that there's a few very friendly faces, people who I know very, very well, and of course, who are also in my book. So that's great. And so Keith and Neera and a few other people, and well, actually it's Neera and Keith who I know have been interviewed in my book, but there's a few other names who I've come across and I've been in touch with actually quite recently, including Pedro, and have scoured some of the recent emails, because there's actually one thing in particular that's of high interest to some of the work that I'm doing now. But yeah, so I'll just share my screen, and I'll just start, just get my screen up and see if I can get to my slides. So can everyone see my slides?
I can see your email.
You can't see my slides.
I think there's something buffering now, or something is loading.
We can see your browser. Are you on two screens?
Hold on. See if that's better.
Looks like
Is that better?
Perfect.
Yeah? Okay, excellent. So, and you don't see any slide notes or anything, because I went through a whole conference where no one told me that I had it on notes view. So I'm just going to go back a bit. So, yeah, so sorry about that. I'll just get to the first slide. Yeah, so just a few words on myself. And I know, listen, the people who are on this call, are far more expert in many areas that I've actually covered in my book. So I won't go into detail with that. And I thought really the more interesting thing I think about my presentation is, I guess, a little bit of reflections on my own journey. And I know people like Neera and Keith are quite close to that, because they've been part of my understanding actually of how to really affect real change. And it's funny that you mentioned longevity as that we started the all-party parliamentary group for longevity, which of course I lead as a director. And I guess in some ways it was quite brave, in the sense that, longevity, and I've spoken to Neera about this, there's a whole language thing around how we talk about longevity, health span, healthy longevity, healthy aging. There are all these different words that are being used to describe this whole industry, this whole marketplace. And I guess for something rather conservative, which of course, I tend to think, policymakers, government as being more in, the conservative camp, with a small c, compared to all of our, the group here today who are sort of, cutting edge scientists, etc. I guess it was sort of brave. And I guess that's part of, what I've tried to do in making sense of this whole ecosystem, is to, yes, speak to the pioneers, a real trailblazer, who of course are represented on this call today, but also to try and understand where everyone else is at, because I think part of the biggest challenge is the whole cultural sort of the inertia bit. How do you actually take people on this journey? And I think that's so fundamental and so important for what we need to do as a group in this community, is how do we do that? I know this is something that Keith Comito understands very, very well. And of course, fundamentally, it's about really engaging the general public and the citizen, because in the end, they're the ones who are going to really, drive this forward. So I, as you can see from the slide, I wear a few hats. the book, it's my first book. It's just come out a couple of weeks ago, and it was really trying to make sense of this ecosystem and how we can affect change. So I set up Collider Health about 3 years ago, and there's a sister company called Collider Science, which is about engaging young people in science and technology. But Collider Health is essentially my gigging, I guess, consulting arm, although I don't really think of it that way. I really, sort of set up ventures really to drive impact in preventative health in the most part. And then I found myself setting up, in fact, I'm on my sort of third social enterprise, but Longevity International was a social enterprise that I set up actually with Dmitry Kaminsky. This is a couple of years ago. And we had this idea to kind of do some sort of big push in the UK market, who of course in many ways were quite ahead of the game in the sense that they had an industrial strategy, with, focused on healthy aging. They're putting significant government money in this space. But really, and really what I could tell, and this is after having worked with UK research and innovation in the healthy aging space, trying to excite companies to get involved in this so-called healthy aging marketplace, that there's the real hurdles to overcome, which is about how we think about growing older, is how we think about aging. And again, it's this whole ageism is a big part of it. There's a lot of people talking about market failure, but I think it's this whole kind of mindset that we have towards. So this comes back to the whole language piece and how we think about this whole industry. So the All-Party Parliamentary Group we set up. I'll just go the next slide here to get a bit of color. The All-Party Parliamentary Group was set up obviously a year before we had COVID sort of break out. By then we had just set up actually and had been furiously working on the All-Party Parliamentary Group activity and Health and Nation, which I'll come to very, very quickly. But I think just going back, I think the time that we've got now is we've got this huge, I think the really interesting thing about COVID, and of course, so much of our thinking has been reset actually, and actually accelerated as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the first thing is I think it's really brought the public consciousness to a different plane. I think most people will realize how fundamental our health is, and we have to really, really regard it as a treasure, as an asset. And of course, what we're seeing is so linked to wealth and prosperity. So I think there's, and I know the World Economic Forum, they're talking about this great reset, and of course I just wrote a piece actually on these lines for them. But I think it's really interesting to see how some of the core themes are converging around this whole idea around system change, systemic change, which is actually really what we're thinking about. Because I think, all of us who are working in the sort of, health, in this longevity space, health span, healthy aging, whatever you want to call it, in the end, we know that really to drive this, it's fundamentally sort of reorienting sort of priorities, the whole sort of infrastructure and how we sort of, governmental systems, business, it's so many different things that need to be kind of reset. We know we're facing a major demographic shift. We know there's going to be significant strain on our economies, our healthcare systems, and this is obviously COVID speaking. So we can't ignore the effects of our growing aging demographic or indeed of chronic diseases any longer. And of course, we talked about MedObesity, which was fantastic, I thought. Obviously, they're looking actually at some of the work. Interestingly, we've got massive problems in the UK. We're on the face of it. Our health inequalities, there's a massive issue there. And of course, we've had a terrible time with COVID. We're basically entering this sort of second lockdown. Our GDP is really suffering. In many ways, we're not looking too good. But the one thing that we do have, and I think a lot of people are recognizing, is that we are being quite brave and pioneering in some respects with regard to this whole healthy longevity agenda. So just moving on, I think we can see through some of the press that we're seeing all over the place, even if a vaccine becomes available in the next year, and we're hearing lots of positive noise about that, we're going to be living with this thing for a long time. And I think fundamentally what the All-Party Parliamentary Group is really focused on, and I'll come onto that in a minute, is about addressing this health inequalities gap. Because I think, what we're seeing through COVID, as we all know, and many studies, as will show this, as people in poor health, obviously chronic diseases linked to age, all these sorts of things we know. And of course, what we're also realizing, I think what governments are realizing, is just the sheer cost of ill health. And so I cite this recent McKinsey report quite a lot, that the cost of ill health, and this is before COVID, was 15% of global real GDP in 2017. And this year they're predicting that the repercussions will reduce global GDP by 3 to 8% in 2020. So that's actually, those are figures that of course are going to wake up. And of course, as the economies around the world have to deal with the whole kind of economic fallout. And of course, the UK is absolutely on its knees in this respect. We know that long-term prevention and health promotion are going to be part of the answer and a huge part of the answer. So in the UK, we're already talking about, syndemics. And of course, we're realizing that actually the real epidemic that we've got is our epidemic of chronic diseases. It's not actually, the pandemic is really highlighting this. And of course, it's mainly linked to lifestyle and social, and many of these are linked, are preventable, linked to social inequality. So we do need a realignment. So this is really what has certainly motivated me over the last 3 years, is how do we do that? So, and we know we need to understand, and again, this was Donna Shalala last week, I met at obesity, the congresswoman. She spoke very much about the need to focus on that handful of things, not thousands of things that are going to drive the impact. And how do you galvanize attention, stakeholder attention, and of course the general public as well. And education is such a massive thing, and I know Keith Comita will agree with that as well. So these are all themes that I've explored in my book, which was my attempt really to kind of make sense of this and to engage the citizen in this debate about our health. And in many ways, we had to delay publication, and in many ways the book is that much stronger because of it, because we've had further reflections. We had to pivot a bit around some of the themes that we addressed and some of the people who I spoke to. So just on to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the work from the All-Party Parliamentary Group that, as I mentioned, we started in March 2019, and over the course of about 9 months we were on this sort of fast and furious sort of journey involving many experts, including some on this call, and an increasing number of organizations, and what became actually a huge collaborative effort. And collaboration is such a key theme in all of this. But what we focused on, and I think this whole idea of focusing on a goal, the mission, that was what was so helpful, when we were doing the Health of the Nation strategy work. We focused on a goal that was set in 2018 by Theresa May, our former Prime Minister. And at the time, the Deputy Prime Minister was Damien Green, who of course is now the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Longevity. And we focused on this goal of 5 extra years of healthy life expectancy while minimizing health inequalities by 2035. So how are we going to do that? So it was really our attempt to focus on that handful of things that was really going to drive the impact here. So so that was published in February 2020. I'd just come back, actually, funnily enough, from Singapore. I'd been invited to speak about some of our work. So it was already getting a little bit of attention. And this is the Healthy Longevity Global Roadmap project that, of course, Victor Zhao and the National Academy of Medicine have just announced actually the recent, I think, Catalyst Awards. And I just come back, and of course, Singapore, they were just waking up to the reality of this pandemic. I know at the hotel I had to get my temperature checked, and I got a nice goodie bag full of hand sanitizer and a mask. Came back, and of course, we had no idea what was going to hit us, but we launched the strategy with full fanfare with the Secretary of State, for Health and Care, Matt Hancock, and of course, we had 9 recommendations. Of course, the following month was when suddenly COVID hit us like a train and had lockdown. But actually, as the data was coming through and as we're seeing the impact, we realized actually that our recommendations were even more urgent and more compelling as a result of what was hitting us with COVID. I'm seeing in my corner view Joe doing push-ups. That's excellent. Of course. That's one way of keeping healthy. And I remember when I interviewed Jose Cordera, every time I interviewed him, he was walking, so excellent. So with that, one of our core themes actually, and I'll come on to this because this is actually a big focus. I mean, now that I've got the book out of the way, it's been published a couple of weeks ago, is, and you'll see there on the slide, is business for health. So that was one of the core recommendations. And actually, while the NHS, which is our public health system, as you all know, and while government were literally heads down sorting out COVID. And indeed, they are still heads down, 100% focused, although we've got Brexit to worry about as well. But we decided we would focus on one of the recommendations, which is the business for health. And so what we did in May is we pulled together a series of roundtables, and this is at the height of lockdown. We've just, had, it was in early May, and of course, the whole mood was, we were in this weird kind of mood as a nation. We got the business community together, and there's a huge appetite to kind of focus on this. What can we do? What could the business contribution do to be to this goal of 5 extra years of healthy life expectancy? So, so we started to put the motion, the wheels in motion to sort of look at this. What could this look like? What could the business coalition do? And we're going to be launching on the 11th of November. And indeed, if you haven't received an invitation already to come to the launch, I'll make sure that you get that after this this call. But we've had huge support, and of course, and you spoke about financial services and insurance. Of course, those are in the main our founding members, our core founding members of this this venture are actually from the insurance and financial services industry. For the first founding partners, and we've also got we've got the support of government. Matt Hancock is also supportive of this. We've got the Longevity Council of the UK, supportive of UK research and innovation, and most importantly is obviously the business community, who of course it's at this time when businesses obviously suffering because of COVID. But we've got people like Paul Pullman, former CEO of Unilever, who are extremely interested in what we're doing. It's absolutely critical what you're starting. And we now have a register of well over 100 organizations who want to join this this group. And really, going back to our core theme, this is very much a collaboration of business focusing, and I'll come on to what we'll be doing in a second. So this essentially, I guess, plants, some of the key areas that we're going to be looking at. And we're proposing the two key things that we're looking at is the business developing a health risk management framework for health, and also this idea of the business index, which is something actually that got one of our top dogs in government, who runs the behavioral economics unit. He was on the advisory board last year. He got very excited about this business index. Like, how do we measure the contribution of business to health? And of course, it was the time that we had our prevention green paper out for consultation. It was when we were looking to New Zealand's well-being index and all these sorts of things. And of course, the Office for National Statistics were looking at this. So that's going to be actually our first focus in the Business for Health venture when we launch next month. How do we do this? And actually going back, and it's going to be fundamental to the other part of this, the health risk management framework for health. And what we recognize, of course, and you will know that there are many parallels. The solutions for living longer, more healthy are obviously linked to living greener. It's also linked to the whole climate change agenda. And indeed, what we discovered, and through the process of speaking to more and more business leaders, health is kind of like where the climate change agenda was like 10 years ago. So we feel, and what we want to do is look at how investment and innovation can be guided by ESG mandates in the same way that they are in the climate change space. Institutional investors should be looking at stranded asset risk like they do in climate change, looking at what causes health risks. They should be reporting on health risks like they do in climate change. We should and most importantly, it's this whole notion. In fact, at a meeting I was at today, it's very true. Of course, governments are always going to be focused on the important and most urgent matters. But what we need is, how can we focus, investment in really long-term sort of sustainable sort of preventative health and care. And this is where we need to look to the business community. We need to look at the big money in institutional funds, pension funds, capital markets, etc. So this is where I think the really interesting and big opportunity is. So the other things on the slide are some other areas that we're going to be looking at as a group. Obviously, we want to, again, this collaboration theme, we want to broker partnerships and have a line of dialogue, with business, because as you all know, and many of you will be very frustrated by this, getting business, but also sort of the government and public sector to really understand, the sheer pace of change and the acceleration of what's coming out in science and technology is just so gigantic, and they just have no idea what's coming. And I think that's such a big challenge. And obviously, what I spend most of my time doing is really trying to educate, evangelize, and try and bring people on this journey. So that's obviously a key part. We know that the role of business is in 4 different areas. So, and some of that is evident on the slide. I mean, there's business, obviously, as an investor, as an innovator, as a buyer, but very importantly, it's as an employer and what they can do to keep people healthy and their employees. So that's obviously a very big part of it as well. I just had Sergey Young actually on a call earlier, sort of looking at corporate longevity and what we could be doing there more of. So that just gives, and obviously a manifesto we want to develop, and I think I think there's a huge amount, especially as we're finding out more about nutrition, how people respond. There's all microbiome and omics space and all that sort of stuff. I think there's a massive area where we really have to tackle the food industry and all the pseudoscience and all the sort of fake, all the claims being made on us, all the stuff that we know just needs to kind of be called out. So that's going to be a big focus. So just to turn a little bit, I guess, more to the role of science, tech, and society, more from, I guess, a societal perspective and a more personal perspective, and how we engage citizens in this debate. So this is where, you can see the cover of my book. It's out, but it's been out for a couple of weeks. And this has been interviewed about 30 people. The foreword was written by Andrew Scott, who's obviously, many of you will know, is very well known as the author of The 100-Year Life. And very pleased that the NHS, through Health Education England, are making this book available for free for the whole NHS and care workforce. So the NHS, if you add them all up, that's 1.4 million people. So the Health Education England, which I think is interesting, they've really recognized, and particularly with COVID, I think there's a real risk of an even greater digital divide happening as we move more online. Obviously, the people who are the most vulnerable, they tend to be the ones who are least connected. They don't even have internet, broadband, they don't know how to use these digital technologies. So that's something that they are having to get to grips with, for their own workforce, but of course for the wider public. So I think the fact that they've accepted and recognized this book as a tool to help open the eyes, because it is hearts and minds and education, because, I write a little bit in my book about an experience I had. I was getting a breast scan, in your 50s, you get, breast screening, whatever, in the UK, free breast screening. And I asked the nurse there, when I was writing my book, I said, so how do you think AI is going to affect your job? And she's a bright nurse in her mid-20s from New Zealand. She laughs, says, I don't think AI is going to affect me in my lifetime. And it's like, it's this huge chasm and gulf of understanding. And I think that's something that we just have to understand exists, in the wider public and indeed even in our healthcare systems, et cetera. So there's a massive need for this mass education. Of course, that was one of the reasons why, when I was approached to the book, I thought, that keeps on coming up over and over again, is how do we really engage with the wider citizen in all this debate? So I interviewed a huge number of people. My final interview was really interesting. And of course, we decided to publish the book, not in April, but obviously later because of the whole COVID impact. And my last interview was actually with Professor Peter Piot, who of course he's a world leading virologist, discovered Ebola, huge in the AIDS sort of mission, and is himself now in the COVID-19 sort of advisory group in the EU. And he came down with COVID, and I was supposed to see him after coming back from Singapore. And my meeting kept on getting rescheduled, and it turns out he had a terrible time with COVID. And of course, he will say, that all the themes and all the issues in terms of how we can harness technology to really deliver on this preventative health and health span objective is so critical. And that's one of the key messages from the pandemic, as we know, obviously to act early and to be ready, of course, for the other two. So that's out there. It seems apparently, it's doing well in the UK. I need a bit more help in the US just to get it more recognized, which is not surprising. It takes a little while, but I'm not going to go obviously into the science and the detail, because everyone on this call is probably going to be far more knowledgeable about this than myself. Although what I've tried to do is to explain some of these concepts in the book around, concepts of the exposome, the whole wider determinants of health, how we're, all the signs of aging and all the stuff happening in the omics space are really sort of uncovering, how we, how our bodies at a physiological, cellular, genetic level respond to all, the wider environment. environment. So these are all concepts that I explore in my book, because I think this is what people really need to understand. And they need to understand actually that what they have in their control to really take charge of their health, which I don't think is appreciated. Certainly, and this is the huge cultural piece that we have to deal with. So yeah, and of course, I talk about, biological age, these concepts, aging clocks. And of course, what I try and do is really lay the groundwork to really get people to understand why, our research in aging biomarkers is so important. And obviously trying to make it more accessible. And of course, I tell a little bit about my own personal journey, trying these things out and what have you. So just we know, obviously through COVID, health our most precious asset. We know that. And I think, just moving on, and I think, what people also need to understand, this is coming more into the sort of the data space, and I'll finish more in some of the pick up on some of the conversations that I've just been seeing on the emails just over the last 3-4 days. People, when they think about health, they often think about healthcare, which is sort of like, what happens when we're sick, in hospitals, doctors. I just think, people have to think about what is it that keeps us healthy and well. And I sort of, and talking about sort of data, I sort of put it into two camps. Sort of there's the healthy data and there's the sick data. So most of our government attention, our healthcare systems, and indeed, the life sciences industry is all focused on, that data that, when we're sick. We have to get people, and you will know it, this is the whole thing around aging biomarkers. It's all around this whole space, which of course is where big tech is and all the rest of it, in, understanding what keeps us healthy and well. So these, again, are concepts that I write in my book. Now, I thought I would just talk a little bit about this other aspect that we're looking at now in our all-party parliamentary group. So this was actually, we've called it Open Life, and of course it's all around open innovation, open data, open health. And what's really, but we wanted to sort of have this word life in it, because we wanted to, it is very much around seeing data across our life course, around all the data that we generate, as we're living our lives. And, we've seen through the pandemic, there are obviously huge weaknesses in how we share data between public, private and public data sharing. And we need that, to obviously inform all the research in the exposome, aging biomarkers, and of course, to prevent the next pandemic. And so there's this whole issue around better systems, governance frameworks, et cetera, and to enable the wider data sharing, new ethical data models. And of course, so I do a little bit of work also, wear my other hats. I do quite a lot of work with NHSX, a new technology arm, the Academic Health Science Networks, and I mentioned UK Research and Innovation. So, there's a lot of money, a lot of expertise, but I think it's about, again, going back to the point that I was mentioning earlier about, is breaking down the walls and how people talk about all these things, which is so fundamental to the work of the All-Party Parliamentary Group and what we're trying to do with this new group on open life data. So what we're doing there is taking inspiration from some of the other open data models. So I know Gavin Starks, who's the former CEO of the Open Data Institute, who was instrumental in the architect for open banking and creating the open banking standard. Obviously, financial data is in many ways much more straightforward than health data. But actually, some of the principles in terms of how you approach it are actually very, very similar. So we're taking some of that thinking and we're creating the Open Life Data Task Group to look at how, and our mission is how can we harness data-intensive technologies to extend and make more equal the healthy longevity of British citizens across the life course. So that's our sort of, and of course, that is completely aligned to the All-Party Parliamentary Group goal. It is completely aligned to our mission for the Business for Health venture that we're launching next week. And I think you'll see some themes here emerging. You have to have, again, it's being really clear on what this overall mission is, the overall goals are, trying to align very, very different groups of organizations, people around this goal. And we're going to, and breaking it down into more specifics, what we'll be looking at in this group, and we've got our first group on the 2nd of November, the second one on the 27th of November, is how we can exploring how data-intensive technologies can make a positive contribution to health, well-being, and life chances of all people equitably. So the equitable aspect, the whole issue around addressing the health inequalities and of course linked to social inequalities inequalities is very much there, proposing solutions for innovation, scaling up and leveraging these technologies across private, public, and academic sectors. Again, so it's about breaking down the walls, ensuring that the infrastructure. So, of course, what's interesting at the time in Britain right now is that we're leaving the EU. We're sort of working out what our whole strategy is going to be in all sorts of fronts, but we're literally in a process of consultation around our national data strategy. We know, even though we're going to be broke as a nation, we know that there's going to be significant investment going into data infrastructure, data interoperability. And right now it's very much focused on the government data machine. But what we want to do is have a role in influencing how they think about data in this context, data infrastructure, innovation, and making sure that infrastructure innovation support is distributed, resilient, reducing inequalities in access and outcomes. And finally, and I think this is where some of the really interesting data models that we're going to be looking at, there's this whole kind of, I guess, tension between, and there's obviously the whole geopolitics, which again, as I write about in my book, the sort of the big tech, China, WeChat, whatever. And then we've got, all the sort of stuff that we know is creating all these sort of dissonance between nations and all the rest of it. We know, Google's now locked in this sort of antitrust trial now. I think this whole issue around building public trust, it is so fundamental. I think this is the whole thing. And I know Yuval Harari talks about this could be the biggest, fallout actually from COVID is this complete breakdown of trust. Well, what can we do? And we're going to look at this in this group. How do we look at public trust? Because there's not enough of it at the moment, and I can probably safe to say certainly not in the UK, and I think probably in the US as well. How can we build that trust? So there's some really interesting models that we're going to be looking at. There's a civic data cooperative model that Ian Buchan in Liverpool is piloting and has great success in terms of building up, local area knowledge around COVID and really harnessing kind of trust in local communities in terms of data sharing. And sort of looking at some of these models, so he talks about it like this decentralized, the national grid for electricity. It's a decentralized way of sharing data, making sure that the value goes back into local communities rather than being siphoned off to big tech or whatever. So I'm really interested in some of these new models and looking to countries like Estonia and Finland who are really leading the way and how we can ethically use data, share data for the public good, in different sort of models. So we're going to be looking at all this in this group. So really, and I've probably been speaking for too long, so I'll close now. So really, I guess, to close, yes, I've got this book, and yes, I hope it reaches a lot of people, because I think it needs a much bigger debate around some of these, core issues and how we can live a healthier life, how we can really address this fundamental issue around health prevention, long-term investment in this space, complete realignment of priorities, and how we can get government working with business, working with academia in a way that's just much more focused, much more collaborative, and at the end of the day, sort of addressing some of these, some of the reasons why it is, our system is broken, why we've got, the situation that we have today. It's ridiculous that we have this chronic disease epidemic in the way that we have. So it must be fixed. So, we're ambitious, there's a lot of work to be done. And of course, very interested in speaking to some of the people. I think Ravi's on the call. And of course, I've been looking at the work that he's been doing, and many other groups. And I know Pedro, I just dropped an email to. So I think, this whole concept of the open repository for biomarkers, these are all the sorts of things that we would be looking at in the context of some of the work that we're doing within the All-Party Parliamentary Group. And of course, we know that there's many exciting and many interesting sort of database that exists, but how do we pull it together in a way that can really deliver on some of these big goals? So I'll finish there, and hopefully, there'll be lots of questions around how we've managed to get so far. And by the way, I think, yes, we do have a lot of attention, but for me, it just opens up so many more challenges because we've got so much work to do. And I still have to come down to the fundamental issue is that if you look at where we're at the moment with the sheer deaths that are still happening, the sheer burden of chronic disease that we've got, the inequalities that we've got, and how terribly we are suffering as a result of COVID, not looking too good in the, in the world rankings. We've got a long way to go to sort some of these problems out, but hopefully, it's a start.
Thank you. Wow. That was, that was a lot. I'm hoping that maybe you can share with us the slides.
Sure.
So that people can kind of follow up, because there were so many projects that you involved. and so many hats that you're wearing. I think I have an immediate question because previously I had spoken to someone from the all-party parliamentary group for future generations. So I'm wondering, like, what kind of effort is that generally, those kind of inter-party groups? And then how does, what kind of learnings have you gotten from that may transfer to the US context? Because I'm thinking aging is currently not an issue yet that is, let's say, politicized to an extent where, which climate change has become. So one really good thing that we should aim for as a group is to avoid that happening in the US, to avoid it becoming politicized. And so that kind of like all-party committee seems like an effort toward that in the UK. So does that apply to the US as well? Like starting something like that? Do you see any potential for applying some of that to the US context?
So interestingly, that's one of the reasons why we've talked about the MedObesity conference. And of course, a lot of the people behind MedObesity, they're very, very interested in exactly this question of it. And this is actually why they've been very involved they're very involved in the roundtables and are extremely interested in how we're going about it to see whether there are lessons that can be taken, into the US, situation. I mean, of course, there are going to be massive differences. And I think obviously the US is a much bigger place. You've got 50 states, and I think, it's kind of decentralized in the sense that you've got your states, the 50 states and all the rest of it. So it's much more complex. Of course it is. And of course we have different healthcare systems and, there's so many differences. But I think, what is interesting about the all-party parliamentary model, and you mentioned the Future Gen, I haven't actually spoken to them myself, but I've spoken to quite a few of the other parliamentary groups, which funnily enough are starting to collaborate more because it kind of goes back to this whole idea of health in all policies, which is, of course, where New Zealand have been very successful, where they basically look and they try and break down. Because, of course, what normally happens, you've got all these government departments. It's like the class that you've got all these government departments that only care about, the targets that and being performance managed within their own departments. So we need to break that down and focus very much. This is where the mission-driven approach is so important because you can break down the silos, you can focus on the overall goal. And so, of course, that's one of our other objectives in our Health of the Nation strategy is this health in all policies approach. So education, transport, because that's the only way that you can connect up, going back to the solutions for living healthier and longer are connected to living greener. It's like active transport, we've got to invest in ways that keep, people, are incentivized to use more bikes and what have you, reduce. It's all, it needs to be connected. You have to hit child obesity. You have to hit education. You have to, so it does need to be connected. This is why I think New Zealand have really got the right recipe. So I did listen to Donna Shalala, the congresswoman, last week at MedObesity to see what she said. And she said a lot of the same things. And it's about focusing on a handful of things that can really, really drive the impact. So that obviously was the task that we set ourselves out to do when we developed the Health of the Nation strategy. That, because we got business, we got the tech community, we got the scientific community, we got the public policy people, we got the financial services sector, we got insurance, we got we took a very, very wide cross-sectional kind of approach to this, which obviously is complicated and complex because everyone will have their own thing they want to say. But you have to, in the end, so it was a process whereby we got people around the table. We had an overarching sort of strategy board. We had different, specific sort of subgroups so we can kind of drill down some of the issues. But then we would reconvene at key points. We had a wider consultation process and some of the key questions that we had as we were going through this process, looking at the evidence. And of course, you'll know, a lot of the evidence around, delivering, better healthy life expectancy are all around behaviors. It's about, the obvious things that we all know about. And then, of course, we also looked at the hot end of science, tech, and genomics, which for many politicians and many policymakers was like, bloody hell, what the hell are you talking about? I've never heard about all this sort of stuff. So I think, there's this whole process of slowly building people's awareness and respect for what's happening outside their walls and really trying to come together around key themes. So it was that process that I think in the end got people along with us, who would never have been there initially. And I had these challenges myself and even, tackling the sort of the hierarchies of the whole system, and this is what I found so interesting actually when we had our roundtables in May. in the height of lockdown, when everything was digital, everyone had to get to grips with, using digital technology. And I can tell you, I had to personally coach quite a few lords and quite a few baronesses and quite a few people on how to use, these technologies, how to even get onto a Zoom call. And then, of course, I also had a lot of people, who are looking from just, there's a chap from, he's a disability rights campaigner. He had no idea how to use Zoom. So I had to literally coach him to get onto Zoom. And what you realize is that you have to have all these voices that are never heard in these discussions. And so that was the beauty about having our, these roundtables, because we had far more people from far more places, from far more voices involved in the discussion. I think it was an eye-opener for a lot of the politicians there, who could just see, you saw the sea of faces, it was all very, very flat. And, everyone was in their kitchen, or, there's, Damon Green, former deputy prime minister, and there's all these other people. And there's a way, and everyone had a role. So we had a whole way that we involved people before, during, and after. And I think it was kind of like an experiment in how to open up the whole discussion. So I think now, so I'm really, really interested in that and how we can use technology. And of course, my big thing that I've been talking about recently is that we're at risk of actually creating this bigger divide, and actually the one way that you can really equalize and make equalize and democratize, all the stuff that we're keen on about, is you need to make sure that people have access to all these technologies and tools so that we're all at the same, so that's a really big issue, which is why I'm really pleased that Health Education England have made the book free, So what I'm saying is that, and I think the all-party parliamentary group as a device is quite interesting, because of course it brings the different political parties together. So it's a way that's a bit safer and a bit, you can kind of just say, listen, I might not agree with you, politically, but actually let's just focus on the real issues here. I think the point about bringing other parties, we had our first joint. In fact, we've got a huge social care crisis, and we've got a lot of work to do there. We brought actually the all-party parliamentary group for social care with our group, plus the all-party parliamentary group for devolution. So we were talking about a whole kind of decentralized approach to building up health resilience. And of course, if you're listening to the UK news now, of course, we've had a terrible time with our COVID track and trace, and everything is around, we've got to engage local and all the rest of it. So that's obviously a massive theme in building up, how communities can really help themselves. And that's the one lesson we've learned from COVID. I mean, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure most of the world, is that, if you trust your communities and when push comes to shove and you've got life and death situations, people will pull together. So it's like harnessing some of the good stuff that is coming out of this crisis. How can you find a way to make our systems work in that way, where you can mobilize communities, deal with all the inequalities, give them more budget, more resources to be able to sort stuff out for themselves. So I think, so there's a lot of that in the UK. I think there's a lot of parallels with what could be taken across to the US situation. But fundamentally, it's about, people just have to, really have to understand how important our health is, and obviously all the science of aging is teaching us how we can be more resilient. And of course, as we're growing older, all the stuff that we know about. Sorry, I'm going on.
I was just thinking it must have been quite the meeting of having an all-group meeting of the all-party parliamentary groups, almost like a meta meeting of all the meetings that are already trying to do the meta work when you get together internally. Thank you. Let's hope that that something like that could still be possible in the US. Let's see. I think November 3rd will give us some idea of that. I know that. I think Keith also had another question in case you want to answer that as well. Keith?
Sure. And first, I just want to say I think what you're doing is amazing, and just congratulations on making the headway in such a short time. I think it's a really great example. Moving on to my question, you had mentioned what you were doing with the Open Life initiative, and I was just curious. You had mentioned Estonia. As part of that diligence, have you kind of done a significant analysis of what exactly Estonia is doing with e-health records? And I asked that question because I've been doing a lot of interviews with people in the government and people in big tech and trying to come up with proof of concept. And what I've learned is that even without blockchain, using very basic cryptography, like what you use to store your password or whatever, you could do a system where you can easily make like very useful things happen that do not exist right now, and I'm just curious. Yeah.
So Estonia isn't as blockchain focused as as you just pointed out. I mean, everyone keeps on, oh, it's all blockchain. It isn't. Some of it's blockchain based, but not an awful lot of it actually. So the reason why I know about that is because I've been fascinated with Estonia for a long time, and I actually, unbelievably, we've got some budget actually from the Academic Health Science Networks to take a team of senior people from the NHS and the Academic Health Science Networks to Estonia and Finland as almost like as a tour, to take them, to show them how they do things. And it was a real eye-opener. And of course, fundamentally, they have a system, it's a unique ID, unique ID that every citizen has. The citizen, they control access to who gets, to see their records. And of course, the whole way that, and they've got the same challenge that we have. I mean, in their health, with healthcare records and all the rest of it. I mean, a lot of it, they have the same problems, digitalization, all the rest of it. But fundamentally, it's the whole way in which they set about, doing it. The citizen is in charge. They know exactly who has requested access to the records. They can decide if they want to share them. They have access to everything that they need as a citizen, and it's all really easy. So I just think as a system, and of course, it's called the e-Estonia project, and they're very, very proud of it for good reasons. I mean, they're able to, I think there are certain conditions for why it was able to happen in the way that it did. I mean, they had just come out of, communist Russia, and of course they're a poor nation, and they decided that this is one of the ways that they were going to kind of, tackle, some of their issues as a nation. And they have 5 million citizens, so it's quite manageable. So that's the other thing too. And so it's a really interesting model. And of course, they do a lot of work. I mean, Finland's just a hop away, on a ferry, and they do a lot of work through the X-Road project. There's a lot of, they cooperate, to countries. And of course, Finland is very, very progressive as well. And of course, they've got quite an interesting culture. Again, it's a small country, so it's easier. They've got an interesting culture there. And I think a lot of it is about culture. That's the other thing. It's about culture. So Finland, they're quite an entrepreneurial country. So they had Nokia, which then went through real, trouble after the financial crash. They're quite entrepreneurial. They've always been very well-being focused, the whole health system. So I think that is set in train, and especially with the whole digital, infrastructure that they have. And they're the first country. I mean, they passed a bill. Actually, it was right around the time that we actually visited them. Secondary use of data. So quite progressive in how they see this whole environment. And of course, the Finnish innovation agency called Sitra, which is really interesting. So they've got this concept, and I can share with some of this stuff. Is this concept of the IHAN, which is what they call the human equivalent of the IBAN standard. So the International Banking Standard. What they're trying to do is to create a data model based on leveraging data for public, wider societal good. So those concepts are actually precisely what we're looking at within the Open Life Group. Because we are interested in creating open access to data, harnessing it obviously for the benefit of to develop socially responsible products and services. And of course, NHSX, they're leading the world in sort of ethics. They've published their code of conduct. And how we can harness, that data for wider public benefit. So this is why some of this work is so critical now, when basically Britain's kind of working out their whole kind of strategy. You've got the EU common digital market, and then you've got all these countries. You've got China, you've got the US. And it's like, what are we going to do? So who knows? I mean, this is what we're going to be looking at a time when the government are focused on their national data strategy, and they're in a period of consultation. So let's hope we open up some minds and eyes about some alternatives. Because I think the world is looking for something different than what's happening at the moment.
Great. I'm glad you did that. So I'm going to, if it's okay, I'd like to reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think if anyone else has a question, I think just feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I mean, you mentioned even that you were in Singapore, and like we had a few people from Singapore on here before to share kind of like their best practices there. And I mean, like, I think one thing that was very interesting is that, they were kind of saying, instead of really saying that they specifically push aging, it almost makes sense to say that you're pushing the driving factor for aging-related diseases, in a sense where afterwards you just have a very different strategy to tackle aging per se. So that was very useful, I think, for what we could be pushing for more in the US. And so I was wondering, did you have any specific kind of like, I mean, you've been around in very different aging communities across, across different countries. Are there any kind of best practices that could apply to a US settings, or do you think there's any kind of like blind spots that we're not seeing yet, like any particular threats that we could be opening more?
Well, when you mentioned Singapore, and we've just been talking about other countries. I think it is so important to think about culture and the sort of the cultural norms and culture, and our whole kind of our whole kind of social and governmental systems. I mean, because they're so important to understand, because that will dictate everything in terms of your approach and your strategy. I think there are some common themes. I mean, so the interesting thing about Singapore, of course, is that the government were very committed to this, and this is where I think there are parallels. Very different cultures. It's a very kind of autocratic kind of system, very autocratic society, Singapore. I remember sitting in the cab drivers saying, oh, at least you in Britain can do what you want. We're told what to do all the time. They do what they're told. But I think what's interesting, the parallel is that the UK government, yes, for all of our troubles, we are, committed to this healthy aging, this goal, right? It's money and our digital strategy and all the rest of it. That was a similar thing with Singapore, and it was right at the top, the government ministers, so it was like right from the top, this is what they were going to do. So I think in that sense, I think that is needed. You do need that political will, because that does help. And, but maybe you won't get it until you have the public pushing for it. So this is how do you get that political will? Because in the end, our politicians are elected by the people. So it's a tough one, but I think there are parallels, but I think there are stark differences too. And you have to just look at every country.
And can you tell us anything more about onboarding, let's say, potential alliances such as, the work that I saw, the McKinsey report, which was definitely like one of the kind of, let's say, actors that we talked about, which is, okay, are there potentially, consultancies, for example, just the insane multiplier effect that you'd have if consultancies would actually factor in different life expectancies into their models that they use into their economic models. That was one thing. And then, of course, banks and insurances were other potential alliances. And I came from an earlier meeting, the point that we had. So can you tell us anything about, are there any alliances that, we could be thinking about that we're not thinking of that really would have an interest in kind of like pushing a more aging focus and preventative agenda and making that more a part for the public?
I think the insurance industry just has to be on your map. Absolutely. It's clear. So everyone who's coming in who's interested in the business for health venture are from the insurance sector. I think so Barclays were also very interested in coming in as a founding director. And then it was because of COVID, they've had to kind of take a little bit of a backseat, and they're going through a bit of trouble at the moment, just, for obvious reasons. So it's not now, but they have actually just received a huge grant from UK Research and Innovation for this investment accelerator program, where Barclays, and they have a whole program around engaging with health tech. And so they're very, very keen on investing in those businesses of the future. So they had a strategic intent on getting involved in this space. So and then from this, got a grant actually from the government, to be able to develop this wider kind of investment-led ecosystem. So I think financial services, interesting kind of ideas, like Dimitri with his longevity banks, longevity card, incentivizing people, the whole health and wealth thing, financial wellness. I think there's some really, really interesting themes that will come about as we understand what is it that keeps people healthy and well. We know financial wellness, not worrying about money, and incentivizing people, behavioral change, nudging people, which could be through, and we know it actually works, Vitality, they reward people with sort of, Starbucks points. It's amazing what people respond to as nudges and behavioral sort of nudges. So understanding that and developing products and services which can really incentivize people, to keep healthy, because we know people, they don't naturally want to go to the gym and, some of us do, but, people need to be encouraged. So what are the techniques and tools to do that? So this is where we've got a lot to learn from many other industry sectors, which is why they need to be brought to the table. obviously financial services, using all the latest thinking and how you encourage saving and nudging people and saving for a longer life, getting people to see if they keep healthy and well, they'll be able to be more productive and be able to save better for their retirement. It's connecting up everything that we know, but in a way that is easy, and it makes economic sense, and it's like, some of this, it's not actually rocket science, but it's just breaking down the structures and the way that things are done. That's the hard part. And now that we've got data and all this technology, that's the easy part. It's actually just changing how we think and how we behave. So absolutely, financial services and insurance absolutely needs to be on your map. And because they're interested in anything, and they also know they've got this big, they don't want to be the next dinosaur, the next Kodak, because of course with AI and being able to be much more targeted with risk profiling and all the rest of it, the old models just aren't going to work anymore. So they have to, in fact, one of our partners coming in into the business for health, they've changed the whole business model, AXA, because they know that they have to change how they do things. So they're actually in the business of health prevention now, moving away from insurance-based products. So it's quite interesting. There's a lot of disruption taking place in that whole space. So I think now's the time to engage with it, to work out what it might look like, in this space, and help, and then being a key player to kind of drive it as well.
Thank you. I remember when we talked about insurers specifically, one thing I think that came from Aubrey was it maybe doesn't really matter how long people will actually live at that point, but how long they expect to live. And one way to kind of like let them know how long they could expect to live is if they use something more accurate in terms of biomarkers or something to track their age, rather than just going from their chronological age. So I'm wondering if there is much work around biomarkers or about around different aging clocks in the UK, if that's a topic that has received much attention there, or is it arrived there?
I think, if you Google, a lot of the insurers have already been doing things like, calculate your healthy life expectancy. And now there's a few, so life expectancy is one, there's a few doing sort of healthy life expectancy. Some are good, some are more detailed, kind of really understanding, some of the bigger data points that drive that. But I think biological age is really interesting. And I think insurers are going to be really interested in all that. And I know certainly a lot of my contacts in longevity space have all been asking for lots of introductions to people I know in the insurance space. But yes, you're absolutely right. Because if people knew, because this is the thing, most people, they underestimate, they think they will die sooner than they actually probably will. So of course there's that longer period of life that actually they need to start planning for. And so most people don't think about that. And I have to even admit myself, I don't think about it in terms of my financial planning. And here I am, I'm like immersed in this space. It just shows, we're just humans. We don't deal with risk very well. That's the problem. So I think there's a huge amount that, we can make it easier for people to help plan better and make it just easy.
You mean the risk of living too long? The risk of living too long? We don't deal with that very well.
No, not the risk of living too long. But what I think most people will agree with is that most people will probably want to live in good health for as long as possible, for however long they actually live. And I think a lot of people don't really, really think about that either.
On this point, it's worth noting that I think this is sort of like a gap in our advocacy currently in the financial aspect of it, is that there are very few tools that show you like, all right, here's the trajectory of your life, assuming nothing happens, you're going to die, all that actuarial stuff that your normal insurance is based on. Even just to simply visualize through, moderate breakthroughs, here's the arc of your life. What's the difference there? And what is that this is not only will you be 10 years biologically younger by 2050, you'll also save an average of $100,000 on healthcare costs if you do
Exactly.
That value proposition is missing. And
I would love to have my own life dashboard that would give me that information. If I could plug in my biomarker data, get an output that says, right, you're going to live, you're going to be quite healthy up until this point, and then you're going to have to maybe worry a few years,
even if it's not precise,
and then it's linked to your financial planning. It's your whole life dashboard. And then that's the way that you incentivize yourself. Because I remember this myself. I remember for a Bupa assessment, because I was on a private health, and I remember I had to fill in a few details about, whether I smoke, what my weight was. And I know I kind of underestimated the amount of wine that I drank. And I remember when I put in the true figures of how much, because I like my wine, and I thought, oh my God, this is actually making quite a big difference on my life expectancy. And if people actually, I mean, I don't drink that much, but it actually, just by fiddling around with those figures, you realize actually it makes, a huge amount of difference. And most people have no idea.
While you were just talking, I just realized even with smoking, right? People might say, hey, it costs $50 or whatever a pack. You're wasting your money smoking. But very rarely do I see, this is how much it's going to cost you in your medical expenses throughout your life.
So with smoking, the analogy is different, right? With smoking, it's clearly bad for medical costs. You have to be careful arguing that they're going to save on insurance costs, because that, as soon as you bring money into the equation, instead of talking about just the years and how many more years they're going to have their grandkids and their great grandkids to look at, you get into cost of living. And unless you're going to get into you're going to come out of retirement, the extra retirement savings you need to make that work is a much bigger net negative than the savings on.
Yeah,
you don't want to bring up the whole, you're going to have to go out of retirement and, you're going to feel great. So that's going to be great, because it's hard for them to imagine the feeling great.
That's why, Carl, you don't make any recommendations. You just present the data.
Unfortunately, it's cheaper to die early for healthcare systems.
There's one more aspect.
We're having a horrible conversation.
There is one aspect that I wanted to mention. You probably know that for our conference this year, I interviewed one sociologist, Mayor Underwood, who is studying the way people see their bodies and interact with their bodies and control their bodies and build their bodies. So she's studying bodybuilders. She's also studying how people perceive longevity and such. And she said one thing that I believe is important for, to make this picture slightly bigger. She said, because of all the informational digital technologies and because all the quantified self technologies, people perceive their bodies as a project now, much more than it was before. Mm-hmm. And it's an important part of the general picture, because once people get the tools for analysis, get the tools for feedback, for measurements and such, it kind of changes the rules of the game for them. This is what happened to the bodybuilder industry once they got access to medical tests that allowed them to, to measure everything that happens to the body. Not just strength, but all sorts of hormones and such. Mm. And now it's something that happens to longevity industry as well, because now as people get access to the biomarkers, they actually get the tool that allows them to have the feedback. And then again, it increases their capacity to perceive the body as a project and modify it, work with it as with a project, with a specific goal in mind. And I think we're about to reach a breaking point in this regard, because once the biomarkers for longevity become well spread in the society, we are going to see this subculture emerge that actually, sees longevity as a goal and knows how to achieve it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think, in the end, we have to see this, we're going to have our early adopters, and obviously the athletes are a classic example of that. And in fact, one of the people I interviewed in my book is Eddie Hall, who's still the world's strongest man, according to him anyway, because I know Thor from Game of Thrones apparently tried to beat him in Iceland earlier this year. And now they're going to have a fight next year to have it. They're having some boxing fight. Anyway, that's all in my book. But anyway, a fascinating story about Eddie Hall, world's strongest man, and how he's really, really used biomarkers, epigenetics, to really get him to focus on what gives him his strengths and his weaknesses too, that he can work with in all of his different sort of athletic pursuits. But I think, we have to be mindful that how do we get more people to see their bodies as their projects? Because of course, you have to look at the spread of people who, some of whom are going to be, it's going to be easier to get them to that place, self-care and getting them more motivated and all that sort of thing. In the end, I still think, we've got this huge challenge where we've got a lot of people who've got so many other things they have to worry about in their lives. And so we have to make health so important and so much part of how we can make their life better with the right, enablers. And of course, and this is where, helping our most vulnerable and dealing with the inequalities piece is so critical to this, to make it more mainstream, that's a real challenge.
Thank you. I mean, I think I said it already at the beginning that I thought it was quite ambitious, and brave to call it really like the all-party parliamentary group for longevity, right? And even like the book title really has live longer. And so I'm wondering because we've been talking the past few meetings a little bit about, okay, if we were kind of tailoring messaging to different communities, there's kind of a trade-off where if we all focused on the same, let's say, message, if we all used aging, or if we all used health extension, or if we all used longevity, that would be great, because then at least people would kind of like at least know that what we are always talking about is always the same thing, yes, rather than them thinking that longevity is something different than health extension and so on. So I'm wondering how you see that trade-off of like messaging differently to different communities, and how you have received different your different messaging there, and why have you chosen this very ambitious longevity message?
So it's such a good point about language, and so this is one of the things I'm looking at as another big project that we have to do, because longevity, I think, has gone through different phases. Actually, what people see when you say longevity, I think a couple of years ago, people would think snake oil, Silicon Valley billionaires wanting to live forever. Whereas now, I think people think of it quite differently. And I think it's very interesting how the whole field has evolved. And I think, so that's really, really interesting. So I think that's something that I've certainly noticed in terms of how people are using language. And funnily enough, Aubrey de Grey, he himself, and I didn't even realize it, but when he read the Health of the Nation strategy, he made the point that we use the word longevity pretty much exclusively we only used aging very, very sparingly. So I think, and we only used healthy longevity together in quite a few sparing places. So already that says a lot, that we could get away with it in a fairly, in the end, we're dealing, government, report, all that kind of stuff. So I think, but I do think this language. So I think that is a must-have international project. This language lexicon for longevity is that's my sort of. I've been talking lexicon for longevity.
Tina, why do you think the change happened? Like, you talked about how a long time ago you would hear these terms and you would think crazy Silicon Valley billionaires who want to live forever, and you would. And I think you were sort of implying, and I think it's true, that you would think that a lot of people would think that disparagingly. So now that the things have changed, would you go back and say those Silicon Valley types were actually right along? Or do you think that it's different? Is there something, is it less disparaging now because they were wrong and there's something different? Or is it less disparaging now because the world has simply caught up to their vision?
I think it's more that the world is caught up, and I think there's the healthy recognition that yes, the guys are going to be, and the women who are going to be out there, leading the way in this, this space, are going to, we have to thank them for doing it, to kind of, people like Elon Musk and all the rest of it, Craig mentioned, in the end, they're cutting edge, they're driving the way, and eventually doing a lot of the research that in the end will eventually benefit people, right? So that we have to thank them for, and I think, but I do think that there is, and I think certainly in the UK, I think the focus of a lot of the research is very much in the way that it's spoken about, and indeed where the funds are coming. It is very much around this increasing the time that we can live a good, healthy life, the health span element. And I know Aubrey will say, and I know Mia will say that kind of like the longevity is the side effect of that. So I think that way of thinking about it actually, I think, is very, very helpful, and especially now, because it focuses the mind on actually what we can do to help the most people as well. And of course, it deals also with, what governments are having to wrestle with, which are, the people who are in poor health and who are, disadvantaged and all those sorts of things. So I think it's a healthy way of looking at it. So going back to the language and how we kind of frame it is so critical. And I think, we were very, very clear, in the government work that, what we're really looking at is reducing the gap between the richest and poorest in their health, their quality of life, the healthy life expectancy bit.
Am I frozen, or is Tina frozen? Tina's frozen.
It's her.
Okay. All right. I wish I could
allow me please to say. She's back. Okay. Sorry.
Tina, you were frozen. You were frozen for a second.
Oh, I was frozen. Sorry.
For a second, yeah. And then I think in that second, Elena covered it over with.
Oh, okay. Yes, I saw that my internet was a bit unstable. So I think the way that we think about it, it's we want to compress morbidity, deal with, make that period, as long as possible, that we have a good quality health, and then longevity is a side effect. And I think that way, I think policymakers can get behind. I think just focusing on life extension for the benefit of those who can afford to pay for it is not something that we would have gotten a lot of attention for. Do you know what I mean? So it's all how you phrase it. And of course, yes, your message might be slightly different for different groups. But I definitely think longevity has become much more mainstream now.
So a bit of feedback on the equality aspect, right? Just as you want to compress morbidity by actually extending the healthy part, not by actually causing the people to die earlier, right? We don't want lower equality gaps by actually like pulling back the health of the best people. We want to bring up the worst people.
Exactly.
Right? So
fair enough.
Language again is important here, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
I just wanted to circle back to what you said about messaging. And I should note that when we were first developing the communication strategy for Lifespan at Iowa, I went through the analysis of all sorts of sociological studies that focus on how people perceive life extension, longevity, aging, what do they think about medical research, and to what degree we can sort of take the risk when we are using a specific and, let's say, industry language when it comes to explaining what we are doing. And it turns out that you are absolutely right. Speaking about medical conditions, diseases, treating diseases, preventing diseases is absolutely the best approach because people perceive it as something absolutely normal and they are not scared, they're not repulsed. Mm-hmm. When you are trying to speak about radical technologies, like say, it begins at the level of genetic modification, okay? Mm-hmm. Anything that is enhancement is already, a gray zone. For some people, it's not acceptable at all. They will prefer to see those technologies developed up to the moment when they do not represent any sort of risk to health. So they should be absolutely evidence-based, properly tried in clinical trials and such. But in general, the medical context is much safer. And I recall that when we were working with Daria Khalturina on improving the Russian legislation, actually, we tried to explain our ideas to the working group. We were working on a governmental strategy for older persons here. We used exactly this language, and there was absolutely no problem with understanding. Even though the group was new to the idea, eventually they understood us. They started to use our arguments, and it was fine. We introduced a few, propositions into this state document, and it was, I would say, easy. It took some time, but it was easy in terms of communication. And I really urge everyone to be very careful with language, especially when people are newcomers to our field.
I agree. I think it's so important. And I saw that so much with my my parliamentary work. It's when there are completely new concepts, completely new language, it takes time. It's a slow process of education. And so you got to, so you have to work your way up there,
One more weird thing that we found out with Dari, because we are also running sociological surveys, trying to understand what kind of expression people will like the most when we're speaking about healthy life extension. And it turns out that people are absolutely fine if we call aging a disease. Unlike the scientific community, who have a lot of fights around this concept. The regular public is absolutely fine, and they do understand the whole idea much better when we frame it this way, and they like it. And they like the idea that aging is something preventable as a disease. Mm-hmm. So again, it all just shows how important it is to use this knowledge accumulated in sociological sciences already, because it can kind of help you a lot to frame it in a good way. And then again, certainly back to what you said, different audiences, different messages. If you try to speak with transhumanists at this very very soft level, probably for them it's not going to be enough. They will prefer you to say, we are going to be immortal and such. But transhumanists are such a tiny share of the general public. So I don't really think that it makes sense to do that in general. In the public space, it's preferable to be very much softer.
Yeah. No, I would totally agree with you. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you. I'm having light problems. It's not you. I'm not dancing with strobo light. This is my room. So two more questions.
Yes.
And if someone else has a question, please feel free to go for it. Otherwise, I would just ask you. So the first thing is, you talked a lot about, like, I guess more official or like more institutional work that you've been doing. I'm super keen to hear, is there like a longevity investment community, really like a private investment community that's gearing up there? So like something like the Silicon Valley types in the UK that you know of? Yeah, maybe.
There's definitely, I mean, it's interesting because there's sort of two camps. There's obviously the more biotech-led camp, and then there's one which I would put more, and then there's of course age tech, age tech investors, which, and then of course there's more ones that are coming through that are more around health and well-being, which is really quite interesting. And what they're trying to figure out is like where they sit in the ecosystem. So I think that's a really interesting space. So it kind of, because, and I know Dimitri talks about this in his whole approach. And I think, longevity it's quite a complex industry because, and especially when you're talking about life and, life and wealth and, you're bringing in, everything from AI-driven drug discovery to financial wellness and this whole kind of ecosystem. So everyone's kind of trying to work out the place that they're going to fit. But I think it's definitely falling quite neatly into biotech driven, sort of financially driven, age tech driven, and then this sort of spot that's emerging, which is quite interesting, the health and well-being element. And some
what
of the
age tech exactly?
Age tech. So age tech is very much around things like care for when you're a bit older, like housing, sort of adaptations for living, things like that, which are more around, it tends to be more sort of smart technologies in the home, sort of support, when you need support, if you see what I mean. And
it's different from the financial driven part,
it's
right?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, again, sometimes there's some blurry areas between them, but generally age tech is around, What I think about age tech, it tends to be around sort of independent living, new concepts of housing.
Making old people's lives better without actually not making them old anymore.
Yeah.
Right. So it's cool gadgets that automatically detect falls or whatever. It's palliative. It's essentially palliative care.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully not in the hospital. Yeah.
So there's little of the, let's say, more ambitious, let's call them just transhumanist or like actual like radical life extension folks in the UK, or do you see an ecosystem even for that springing up, or is it more radical, pragmatic?
We've got a radical, ecosystems in the UK. I mean,
Are you asking about if there's an investing ecosystem for radical life extension?
Oh, sorry.
From the investment part, Allison.
In the investment part, I know about the more transhumanist.
I don't think worldwide anywhere there's really that radical life extension is really separate from the biotech, because you need the biotech to get that.
Yeah, I would say I agree with that.
From an investment point of view, what are you going to invest in that's radical life extension that's not biotech?
No. I mean, I definitely I get that. I get that they're the same in terms of the tools to be used. But I'm thinking, what motivates people to be interested in that? Is it more let's focus on biotech because there's a biotech boom, and with COVID even more so, and so on, or is it really this like, no, we actually want radical life extension, and that's why biotech is a tool that we need for that. Those are still two different groups in terms of how you appeal to them. And I do think in Silicon Valley we have both. And I'm wondering whether you have the kind of like the second more radical type as well in the UK, or whether
I think it's quite different. I think we're a little bit more modest in our aspirations. I don't think we have a radical life extension community like the one in Silicon Valley, to be completely, I really don't think we do. I think, and I agree with Carl, it's very much rooted in the biotech community, whatever we do have. I think, we may be a bit more advanced in the sort of the age tech space than perhaps in the US, I don't know. But and that's just because, again, I think we've got certain strengths as a nation, and we've got, great tech ecosystem. We've actually got a great life sciences industry, as you know, too. But I think, where we're quite unique is this again, is this blend of like the financial services, tech, life sciences, but yeah, we have a few groups that are, sort of transhumanist, sort of, I don't know if you know David Wood. In fact, he probably would love to be part of this group, David Wood, who runs London Futurists. And he does some really, really good stuff, and he's always involved in the stuff that we're doing, because you need that. You need all perspectives, to kind of look at, what's coming up and, what are some of the good solutions.
Tina, how much overlap do you see between the real biotech stuff versus the age tech, the financial stuff, and this sort of general health optimization type
stuff?
How much
overlap?
In terms of investment community?
Well, so it's interesting you say that, because actually what we're trying to do is to make it more kind of collaborative, because I think there's a lot that each sector could learn from each other as well.
Really, that's interesting, because I have the total opposite opinion. I actually don't like the fact that Dimitri and Margaretta's organization tries to lump all those other three things in with what I consider to be the only true real area, which is the biotech stuff.
Okay.
I think age tech should be completely out of scope for this group, and for most investors who really want to move the needle on longevity and health. And I think the same thing of financial services, that's fine. They're an important area, but they have nothing to do with actually making people healthy for many, many, many more decades.
I can understand your perspective. I would probably disagree with you on some of your assumptions, because I think for people to have a really good, healthy, longer life, you need to have a broader view of actually what that good life looks like, and what will it comprise to give you that good life. So I do think it's a. Anyway,
if you were 40 and you stopped aging and you never became 80, you wouldn't need any innovative new financial services to be okay financially, nor would you need any age tech, right? So that's sort of the basic argument. Anyway, I think
we have our different perspectives. I think, if we stopped aging in its tracks and we were youthful forever and didn't need any, I think that's one perspective, and it's a valid perspective. I just think it depends, in the end, we're working in a real world with real systems, with real people. And, in the end, we have to go where, and I think you're painting a scenario that perhaps might work for a certain type of group of people. Also, we have to be mindful of that. So it kind of comes down to, if you're talking to the early adopter types, who'll be, who've got the money and the resources to be able to have that advantage. That looks a bit different if you are speaking to a different group of people who don't have those advantages, that need support from a wider base. And this is where the other solutions are really, really important. So it comes down to who you're appealing to, who your target audience is. And I think every point of view is important.
All right. Thank you.
That's part of the discussion, the debate.
Awesome. Well, I think, I'm not sure if Carl's frozen. He may be frozen, actually. So. Oh, no, not frozen. Okay, good. Okay, I didn't want to cut you off there. But thank you. I think we are now almost half an hour over. I think one last thing, and I make it 2 questions in one, and you can decide whether you want to take 1 or 2, is what do you think this group's potential, let's say, comparative advantage could be? Like, do you think there's any open parts that you think are currently not looked into? And then B, how can we help you and your project along? Like, what's the thing that the community could do for you? Both of them.
What I love about the community is I love the health extension brand that you have as a group, because I think that's really clever. Because I think because that ultimately is where it's at the moment too. Is like, how can we extend our health in all sense of the word, in whatever our point of view is. I think that's where it's at now. So I think that's really, really, really important. I think I think there's obviously so much, and you've got obviously a huge group of people in the US, and there's such a huge amount of work to do in the US. So I think if we can somehow club together to do what we can to share our learnings and experiences, do some very, very hard work. I mean, who knows who's going to get in on November? I have my own. I think it's looking well. I don't want to jinx anything, but there's a lot of work to be done. I think there's some serious issues in the US that need, there's some serious dismantling of systems before, we can really, really tackle, really extending health extension for more people. I mean, obviously I've got a social mission in everything that I do. I want to see this longevity dividend, or whatever you want to call it, I want to see it to reach more people. So I think I have a broader perspective on that, which I think certainly with what we're seeing in the US situation, I think could, I think is important issues. We've got, and the UK, and we've got a lot to learn from other countries. So I think anything that we can do to really take stock of what's working in other countries. And the UK, we certainly do not have all the answers. We are probably very low on the ranking order in that respect. So, we've got a lot of work to do. So I think anything that we can share between countries is really important. And on that note, I should mention, and I'll send the link out, we are actually running an international event on the 11th of November, right before the launch of Business for Health, where we're getting everyone, Japan, Singapore, United Emirates, US, Canada together, looking at what we can share. So I'll make sure to send you the link, because I think that's really, crucial, especially in this world that seems to be wanting to get more and more, segregated and national. I think we really need to come together.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. I would much appreciate that. Also for the health extension name, I cannot take credit. I think Joe Betzler initiated the health extension salons, and probably someone else came also up with that name before that. But
I think that's a clever brand. Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much again, Tina, and I hope to see all of you again next week. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Alison, and everyone. Cheers. Bye.